It began with nothing more than silence, an absence that grew louder with each passing hour. In the small, sun-faded community of Lake Brownwood, a town where front doors stayed unlocked and neighbors knew the names of each other's dogs, the disappearance of a young woman should have rung louder alarms. But it didn't. Not at first. Rhonda Shante Blankenship had left home on foot, something she did regularly. She liked the open air. Walking helped her clear her mind. For a 25-year-old trying to reset her life, these daily walks were routine, predictable, even comforting. That Friday she left in the late afternoon. No overnight bag, no phone charger, no plans to be gone long. But when night fell and Shante hadn't returned, something shifted. The silence became unsettling. Her mother was the first to feel it, an intuition, maternal and primal. At first she tried to rationalize. Maybe Shante had run into a friend. Maybe she was at someone's house. But the minutes kept ticking, and by the next morning, there were still no calls, no messages. Her phone rang, but there was no answer. Then it went dead. At noon, the car still sat in the driveway, untouched. That detail, seemingly small, told investigators everything. Shante hadn't planned to leave for long. She hadn't packed a bag. She hadn't taken her car. Whatever happened to her had occurred not far from home. The local police logged it as a missing persons report, as they would with any adult who'd been gone less than 48 hours without known danger. But the file didn't sit idle for long. By the evening of the second day, the department quietly escalated the case. Officers canvassed the area. They knocked on doors. They walked the wooded lots behind her neighborhood. What they found, or rather didn't find, only added to the mystery. There was no sign of a struggle, no screams reported, no suspicious vehicles captured on the few security cameras in the area. Her room remained untouched, her belongings in place. Her shoes, the walking ones she always wore, were missing. That was all. It was as if she had stepped out into the open and simply vanished. For those unfamiliar with Lake Brownwood, it was easy to underestimate the town's insular nature. With a population just large enough to host a school, a gas station, and a handful of family-run stores, it was the kind of place where secrets were buried in silence, not spoken aloud. Crime was rare, tragedy even rarer. This was not a town hardened by violence or mystery, which made what happened next all the more unsettling. Within 36 hours of her disappearance, family and volunteers organized informal search parties. They printed flyers, called friends, and drove back roads looking for anything, a piece of clothing, a footprint, tire tracks. A neighbor mentioned seeing her earlier in the day near the edge of the woods. Another thought they heard voices near the old farmhouse off County Road 101, but no one saw her again. By the 48-hour mark, it was no longer just a missing persons case. It was something darker. Shantae's phone was traced, but had last pinged from a location near the lake, hours before it shut off completely. No further digital trail, no text messages or posts suggesting plans, fear, or distress. It was this precise absence of data, no cries for help, no rushed departures, no signs of planning, that first triggered suspicion among investigators. Voluntary disappearances have patterns. They involve money, prior attempts, social disconnection, or a catalyst, often an argument or emotional breakdown. Shante showed none of these. She had struggles, yes. Like many people her age, she had wounds from the past, but she wasn't erratic. She was reconnecting with family. She had a boyfriend. She was trying to get clean. By all accounts, she had reasons to stay. In cases like these, the first 72 hours are critical, but even by the 48th, there was something particularly unsettling about the lack of physical evidence. She hadn't just disappeared. She'd been removed, quietly, intentionally, and most likely by someone who knew how to avoid leaving traces. Then came a tip, subtle, easily overlooked. A man from the search party mentioned an abandoned property out on a gravel road, a place the locals casually called the haunted house. It was an old, dilapidated farmhouse that had been left to rot for years. Teenagers sometimes broke in chasing thrills. But in recent years, people stayed away. The place had a reputation, unverified stories of screams, animals refusing to go near it. Most dismissed it as superstition, but what the man remembered was this, a door that looked freshly disturbed. The lock, oddly intact, but the dirt in front of it had been disturbed, the grass flattened. It was a detail that might have meant nothing, until it didn't. Investigators visited the property the following morning. The farmhouse was what they expected. Empty rooms, broken windows, rusted metal. But the door to the cellar was secured with a makeshift wooden bar, newer wood against the old structure. That was enough. Officers forced it open. The air was heavy, stale, and clung with the scent of damp earth and something metallic beneath it. In the far corner of the basement, beneath a torn sheet of plastic and fragments of cinder block, they found her, partially concealed, cold, still wearing the clothes she was last seen in. That discovery marked the end of the search, but only the beginning of the case. The presence of the body was only the first truth uncovered. The how and why remained hidden. And more importantly, who had put her there, and how had they done it without leaving a trace? The small town of Lake Brownwood would never be the same, and neither would the people who once believed their streets were safe simply because they were quiet. Lake Brownwood was quiet that week, too quiet, and not the kind that usually brought peace. After the discovery of Rhonda Chante Blankenship's body in the basement of a long-abandoned farmhouse, the natural calm of the town turned into something else, an oppressive hush, like the collective holding of breath. The water of the lake, which once reflected the skies of Texas like glass, now mirrored a darkness that had settled over its community. Something had shifted. Beneath the still surface, suspicion, grief, and the raw presence of fear had begun to fester. Chante's murder had broken more than a life. It had cracked the perception of safety in a place that, until then, had no blueprint for tragedy of this scale. Towns like Lake Brownwood don't usually appear on maps of violent crime. The people who live there believed that bad things happened somewhere else, on the news, in far-off cities with strangers, not here, not to someone they knew by name. And yet, there she was, found lifeless, hidden in a place known for its rumors, dismissed for its absurdity, and now cemented in infamy. But what the town didn't yet know, and what investigators were only beginning to unravel, was that this case wouldn't just test the limits of forensic science in rural America. It would test the very assumptions people held about guilt, proximity, and what evil actually looks like. In the hours following the discovery, the crime scene was locked down. Law enforcement established a perimeter around the decaying structure, bringing in forensic units from neighboring counties. The air inside the basement remained thick, difficult to breathe, as if saturated with the silence of what had occurred. Technicians moved slowly, not just to preserve evidence, but because something about the space demanded caution, almost reverence. The basement floor was unfinished, a mix of concrete and dirt poorly leveled. Chante's body had been partially covered, suggesting concealment rather than disposal. Her injuries were visible, but their nature would not be fully detailed until the autopsy. Still, the scene told its own story, a deliberate act. There were no signs of hurried violence, no splattered chaos. This wasn't spontaneous rage, it was methodical, even careful, and that detail unsettled investigators. As forensic teams combed the area, a collection of items were logged. Near the body, they found a rusted blade, the kind typically mounted on a weed cutter, stained and partially embedded in the dirt. A discarded water bottle sat nearby, out of place for a location no one had visited in years. Faint footprints led in and out of the basement, though recent rains had rendered them incomplete. There were drag marks, but they were controlled, indicating strength and purpose. And most notably, they found the lock. The wooden beam used to seal the basement door was relatively new, fashioned from pressure-treated lumber. Whoever had brought her here didn't just hide her. They planned for no one to come looking. In criminal investigations, this kind of containment signals something very specific: knowledge. The perpetrator didn't choose this house randomly. They knew about it. They were familiar with the property, or had reason to believe no one would stumble upon it. In an area like Lake Brownwood, with so few abandoned structures, that detail narrowed the field of possibilities. But narrowing wasn't the same as identifying. Investigators turned back to Chante's life. Who would want to harm her? Why? She wasn't involved in criminal activity. No major enemies. She didn't owe anyone money. She'd had her struggles, yes. Some issues with substance use in the past, some toxic relationships. But she was trying to rebuild. She'd recently reconnected with her mother, had a boyfriend she saw regularly, and had plans to get her GED. She was not suicidal. She was not unstable. Everything pointed to a woman trying to turn her life around, not one walking into her own death. So the question deepened. Who knew she was vulnerable? And who used that knowledge to make her vanish? That's when a local volunteer, a man who'd assisted with the search, mentioned something offhand that reframed the case. During the early hours of the search, he had explored the backwoods behind a stretch of abandoned farmland and thought he saw something near the property. He hadn't approached at the time, writing it off as just another derelict building, but what caught his attention in hindsight was the ground in front of the door, freshly flattened grass, a slight indentation in the earth. That was what led police to the house, that tiny detail. Without it, her body might have remained hidden indefinitely. It was the kind of observation that, while small, made all the difference. And in investigations like these, the devil is rarely in the dramatic. It's in the subtle, the nearly missed. As the autopsy began, the forensic pathology team focused on time of death and injuries sustained. Preliminary findings suggested Shantae had died not long after disappearing. There was no sign of prolonged struggle, no defensive wounds that would suggest a long fight. But the injuries were significant, deep, focused, and consistent with bladed trauma. It appeared that she had been taken by surprise. For law enforcement, this created a troubling timeline. Shantae had vanished in broad daylight, walking through familiar neighborhoods. The farmhouse was only a few miles away. Whoever took her had done so quickly and cleanly. That kind of operation, if one dared to call it that, didn't suggest chaos. It implied calm, which meant the suspect was not acting in panic. Detectives revisited interviews with neighbors. Some recalled seeing Shantae pass by as usual, heading toward the walking path near the tree line. One person said they thought they saw her talking to someone in a dark-colored truck, but couldn't make out a face or license plate. Another claimed to have heard barking that evening, the kind that didn't stop, but dismissed it as dogs reacting to raccoons. None of it added up, not yet. From a criminal profiling standpoint, certain patterns were becoming clear. The killer either knew Shantae personally or had studied her movements. There was no sign of random abduction, no evidence that she'd been followed for days. It had the markings of someone who lived nearby, someone who had opportunity, access, and perhaps reason. But that last word, reason, remained elusive. In many homicide cases, investigators can often triangulate the motive early on: jealousy, revenge, financial gain, domestic conflict. But here, there was a strange hollowness. No ex-boyfriend with a history of violence, no fights reported, no signs of recent threats. The killer had stripped away not just Shantae's life, but also any easy explanation for why. And that lack of narrative terrified the investigators more than any confirmed motive would have. Because when someone kills without clear reason, it usually means the reason lies entirely within them, hidden, detached from rationality, and far more dangerous to predict. The community held a candlelight vigil 3 days later. Hundreds showed. Some wept openly, others remained silent. For many, the horror wasn't just in what had happened. It was in the realization that someone among them was capable of doing it, and still out there. The lake remained still, but beneath its surface, something darker had begun to rise. The landscape of rural Texas offers few places to hide, and yet that vast openness, dotted with rusting fences, weather-worn sheds, and fields that stretch beyond sightlines, can become a labyrinth for those searching in desperation. When Shantae Blankenship's body was found, the search didn't end. It shifted, from locating a missing person to unearthing a motive, from following footprints to decoding silence. The community had already mobilized days earlier, forming makeshift search parties long before official task forces took over. They were neighbors, relatives, even strangers. What united them wasn't just concern for Shantae, but a sense of shared vulnerability. If it could happen to her, it could happen to anyone. This wasn't just a case. They had unknowingly been living beside it. In interviews with volunteers, many recalled the heat, dry air, dusty boots, the sun beating down on shoulders as they combed trails, abandoned trailers, roadside ditches. Some followed gut feelings. Others retraced the last known steps of Shantae. A few drove out to remote barns, terrain where police presence had long thinned. No one had suspected the farmhouse immediately. It had been dismissed for years, rumored but forgotten. It wasn't on any map. Yet that overlooked location held the truth everyone feared. Now, the discovery of her body had recontextualized the entire map of the investigation. Every missed detail in the first 48 hours became a potential key. So the search resumed, not for a person, but for the path that had led her there. Law enforcement focused next on canvassing the area around the crime scene. A radius was drawn, and properties were cataloged. A log of everyone who lived, worked, or moved through those acres was created. Soil was tested for tire tracks. Drones were flown to identify unusual trails. They documented everything: fencing patterns, wildlife paths, even brake lines in the tree canopy. Because the killer had chosen the farmhouse not by accident, but through familiarity. That meant geography could become motive. Investigators also went back to Shantae's last visible hours. Witness statements were collected and cross-referenced. Several community members remembered seeing her walking, alone, as she often did, toward the lake path, which curved around backwoods properties and eventually opened onto a clearing near the farmhouse. One neighbor swore they saw a figure loitering near the fence line. They hadn't mentioned it before, chalking it up to a teen cutting across land. Now that small recollection carried weight. An important psychological shift was emerging. What had once been dismissed as irrelevant was now potentially significant. This is common in homicide investigations. The perception of normalcy breaks down only in retrospect. People remember odd glances, unusual trucks, brief conversations they'd forgotten. Investigators knew they had to reframe every moment of that day through the lens of intent. They began reconstructing Shantae's route from the moment she left her home. She wore walking clothes, light sneakers, a zip-up jacket. She had her phone, but no bag. She passed a neighbor's mailbox, took the right fork in the path that edged the woods, and from there, vanished. That stretch, between the split in the trail and the clearing behind the farmhouse, became ground zero. Tracking dogs were brought in, though by now the scent trail was thin. Still, one K9 unit paused along a barbed wire fence line, near a portion of tall grass pressed flat, as if someone had been waiting or watching. No footprints remained, but the vegetation told its own story. Investigators marked it. If Shantae had been intercepted, this could have been where. Parallel to the forensic strategy, interviews intensified. Officers spoke again with known contacts, her boyfriend, former acquaintances, former employers. They were looking for patterns, unreciprocated attention, controlling behavior, or sudden interest in her disappearance, but no one stood out. No open hostility, no recorded threats. This created a unique investigative tension. The case lacked the usual suspects. This void forced detectives to re-examine less conventional leads. Was there a local with mental health concerns and access to the farmhouse? Was there someone recently released from jail who had gone under the radar? They ran background checks through multiple counties. They requested medical histories where legally available. Still, the results were murky. No direct hits, no confessions, just silence and the sense that someone was watching. The farmhouse itself became a focal point of media attention. Reporters hovered outside the police line. Headlines sensationalized it. House of Shadows. Basement of Secrets. But behind those words, the site revealed truths in layers. The building had no electricity, no recent signs of occupancy. But there were fragments. A crumpled energy bar wrapper, a lighter, what looked like a footprint on the back wall. Small, seemingly insignificant artifacts that hinted someone had spent time there recently. Crime scene analysts used 3D scanning equipment to capture every surface of the basement. The temperature, the moisture, the entry angle of light through the fractured ceiling, all recorded. Even insect activity was measured, assisting in pinpointing time of death. The science was methodical, impersonal. But to the investigators standing inside that basement, nothing about this was cold. It was chilling. Meanwhile, back in the town center, community response grew increasingly polarized. Some demanded answers, calling for state involvement. Others turned inward, speaking less, trusting fewer. Misinformation spread, names were whispered, accusations surfaced without evidence. Law enforcement had to battle two fronts, uncovering the killer and managing public fear. But what stood out in those days, among the dust and speculation, was the growing realization that someone in that very community, someone within reach of these efforts, had knowledge no one else did. They hadn't confessed, they hadn't run, they were blending in. And so the search expanded, not across physical land, but deeper into the lives, habits, and histories of those who had crossed paths with Shantae in the weeks before she died. Because somewhere, buried beneath the surface of routine interactions, lay the answer, not in grand gestures or acts of violence, but in subtlety, in who saw her, who lingered, who returned to places long forgotten. In small towns, familiarity is often a shield, but in this case, it was becoming a mask. There is a reason some places are left behind. Not every abandoned structure is merely forgotten. Some are avoided. The farmhouse where Shantae Blankenship's body was found had long stood on the outskirts of Lake Brownwood, like a relic from a time that people preferred not to remember. Its broken windows and sagging roof beams weren't just signs of neglect. They were warnings in plain sight. Local kids once dared each other to get close, but the house never welcomed visitors, only absorbed their silence. Over the years, it became known simply as the haunted place, but now it had taken on a far more chilling meaning. It wasn't ghosts that had made it dangerous. It was the presence of someone real. As the investigation deepened, attention turned back to that structure, not for what had happened inside, but for what it could reveal about who had chosen it. Detectives knew that selecting a dump site is rarely random, especially not when it comes to a location with such local notoriety. It wasn't just remote, it was culturally marked. That meant the person who brought Shantae there wasn't a stranger to the area. They didn't just know where it was, they understood what it meant to others. Its very reputation may have been part of the plan. Crime scene specialists returned to the property with a more refined focus. The goal wasn't just to collect physical evidence, it was to extract behavioral information. What did the killer do before, during, and after placing the body in the basement? Where did they park? How long were they there? Did they return afterward? These were the kinds of questions that couldn't be answered with fingerprints alone. They required pattern recognition, subtle spatial analysis. At the front of the house, officers observed fresh markings on the dirt track that led in from the service road. Though most of the area had been disturbed by search teams and reporters, parts of the path were still relatively undisturbed. A vehicle had definitely been driven in. The spacing of the tire marks and the depth of the impressions suggested a small pickup truck, not a large commercial vehicle, no trailer, something manageable, local. That detail, while small, narrowed the possibilities further. Inside, the basement remained the primary scene. Blood pattern analysis showed that Shantae had likely been attacked elsewhere and then moved. The floor bore signs of transfer, drag lines, smeared impressions, a lack of arterial spray. That meant the violence hadn't occurred there. She had been placed, not killed, at that location. And placing a body isn't merely disposal, it's decision-making, it's personal. Detectives photographed every angle of the basement. They identified points of entry, areas of disturbance, and took samples of soil and wall residue. The forensic anthropologist on site noted that some of the debris atop the body, broken bricks, shattered wood, had likely been added later, not part of the collapse of the structure itself. It was a clumsy attempt at concealment, but even that effort indicated hesitation. The killer hadn't just left her in haste. They had paused. They tried, albeit poorly, to erase their act. Investigators reviewed the history of the property. It had once belonged to a family that had moved away over a decade prior. Since then, the county records showed no formal transfers, no updates, yet multiple signs indicated someone had been accessing it. Cigarette butts near the porch, recent boot prints in dust-covered floorboards, and strangely, a freshly cut trail through the field behind it leading toward a nearby cluster of trees. That trail hadn't been there during the original walkthrough. Someone had returned. This realization caused a shift in urgency. If the killer was revisiting the scene, either out of panic or compulsion, there was a window of opportunity to intercept. Surveillance was quietly placed near the farmhouse, unmarked vehicles stationed along access roads, wildlife cameras mounted at key points, but the house itself remained still. At this point, behavioral profilers were brought in to assist. Based on the scene, they painted an outline, not of the killer's face, but of their methods. The individual was likely young, local, familiar with rural terrain, and untrained in crime scene avoidance. Their decision to place the body in a structure rather than a field suggested an attempt to maintain control. They didn't want the body exposed. There was shame, or at least a need to delay discovery. And perhaps, in some twisted sense, the house felt like neutral ground, neither theirs nor hers. Parallel to the physical investigation, the emotional toll on the community continued to rise. At school board meetings and Sunday sermons, the topic dominated conversation, not just in hushed whispers, but in direct questions. How did this happen? Who could have done it? Was it someone we know? People started locking their doors again. For the first time in years, porch lights were left on through the night. Parents drove their daughters to work instead of letting them walk. And beneath those new routines lived a deeper anxiety. Not that something had happened, but that something or someone hadn't left. Among investigators, the concern grew that the killer might not be a one-time actor. The way the body had been handled, the selection of the site, it wasn't polished, but it was organized, methodical in certain ways. It lacked frenzy. There was room, they feared, for repetition. They couldn't afford to wait for it. They began reanalyzing cold leads, re-interviewing anyone who'd ever trespassed on the property, checking arrest logs for trespassing, petty crimes, or mental health detainments near the area. Each name was logged, reviewed, and compared against notes from Shantae's case. They looked for overlaps, people who'd interacted with her, even briefly, because in a small town, paths cross more than people realize, and often, danger wears the face of familiarity. In the end, the house didn't just contain evidence, it contained symbolism. A place long ignored became the focal point of justice. A forgotten structure repurposed by evil now served as a canvas for reconstruction, not of what it had once been, but of the terrible choice someone made to use it. Small towns are built on assumptions, trust passed along generations, handshakes substituting background checks, and silence often mistaken for safety. In Lake Brownwood, the idea of evil had always been theoretical, something you saw in headlines from far-off cities. It wasn't supposed to breathe the same air as your neighbors or stand behind you in line at the grocery store. But once a violent act shatters that illusion, it doesn't just reveal the crime, it exposes the fabric of the community itself. After Shantae Blankenship's body was found, the town's attention turned inward. The fear was no longer about what had happened, but about who had done it, and whether they were still walking free. Rumors began to spread with more force than facts. People speculated in private messages, hushed phone calls, online forums that served as unofficial town bulletins. With no named suspect, everyone became a possibility. And in that vacuum, reputations became collateral. The investigation team knew this was dangerous. False leads waste resources, but more importantly, they destroy lives. So detectives revisited their interviews, this time with heightened sensitivity, not just listening for facts, but watching body language, noting inconsistencies, mapping relationships. In criminal profiling, patterns often emerge not from what is said, but from who avoids saying it. They started with proximity. The farmhouse had no recent records of visitation, yet someone knew it well enough to use it strategically. That narrowed the field. Then they looked at timelines. Who had no alibi in the hours when Shantae disappeared? Who left town briefly after the body was found? Who suddenly changed their routine, quit a job, cut ties with the local community? Patterns slowly began to form, not in the shape of one person, but in clusters. A few individuals drew attention, not for blatant behavior, but for subtle detachment. One neighbor who previously expressed interest in helping the search had grown quiet. Another, who spoke freely early on, now hesitated under questioning. None of this was definitive, but collectively it pointed toward a psychological shift, a signal investigators often recognize as guilt manifesting indirectly. To better understand Shantae's final days, investigators conducted a social mapping exercise. Every text, call, and interaction she'd had in the month before her disappearance was analyzed and coded. She hadn't lived a life of secrets. Her patterns were consistent, her relationships relatively stable. But one entry stood out, a brief text exchange with someone not well known to her inner circle, casual, non-confrontational, but vague. A meeting point was mentioned. No context, no follow-up. That contact became a person of interest. Still, law enforcement exercised caution. In a town where everyone is known, bringing in someone for questioning is equivalent to public indictment. So they worked quietly, seeking behavioral evidence rather than immediate confrontation. Meanwhile, the psychological landscape of Lake Brownwood was shifting. Parents once indifferent to local gossip began obsessing over their children's schedules. Stores installed new cameras. Town hall meetings turned into tense debates about safety, surveillance, and the kind of people who might do such a thing. But underneath those words lay something more uncomfortable. No one wanted to admit that the kind of person they feared might already be someone they'd known, smiled at, or hired for work. The deeper investigators went, the more they began to see the case as less about brutality and more about control. Shantae had not been randomly targeted. She had been watched, chosen. The killer didn't act impulsively. The signs pointed to calculated decision-making, the location, the time, the effort to obscure the body. And that level of control, when paired with familiarity of the area, narrowed the psychological profile further. They began reviewing past incidents. Not violent crimes, but lesser disturbances. Trespassing, voyeurism, aggressive behavior dismissed as youthful acting out. Sometimes these are early indicators of escalation. And in the history of Lake Brownwood, a few names surfaced more than once. No arrests, but patterns. From a criminal investigative standpoint, understanding the community is just as critical as understanding the suspect. In towns like these, people often minimize uncomfortable truths to preserve harmony. They rationalize unusual behavior, especially from people they've known since childhood. But the capacity for harm doesn't always emerge from outsiders. Sometimes, it grows quietly inside the very systems meant to keep people safe: homes, schools, churches. Shantae's case had forced the town to confront that reality, and the weight of it was beginning to show. Friendships strained, long-standing business relationships broke down. Teachers reported students asking questions they couldn't answer. Grief became entangled with suspicion. Through it all, the investigators stayed focused. They knew from experience that a killer hiding in plain sight often counts on chaos to blur the edges of truth. The louder the noise, the harder it is to hear what matters. So the team tuned it out. They returned to the physical evidence, cross-referenced with new psychological leads, and slowly began to triangulate behavior, opportunity, and motive. They didn't have a name yet, but they had a mask, and it was beginning to slip. In homicide investigations, there are moments that break away from the routine, moments that shift the entire direction of the case, not because they bring clarity, but because they introduce a new kind of silence. The silence of recognition without identity. This is what happened when the results of a cutting-edge forensic process came back. For the first time, the investigation into Shantae Blankenship's murder was no longer entirely blind. The crime lab had given them a face. It wasn't a photograph. There were no names attached, no mugshot pulled from a past arrest. What investigators received was the product of DNA phenotyping, a technology used to generate a predictive visual profile based on biological material left at a crime scene. The sample recovered from Shantae's clothing, traced to skin cells, not blood, had yielded enough genetic markers to allow for a digital rendering: skin tone, eye color, facial structure. It was a sketch pulled from the double helix. The image was unremarkable to anyone outside the case, but to investigators, it was a jolt. The face depicted wasn't that of a hardened criminal. There were no visible scars, no signs of age or violence. It looked like someone you might pass at a hardware store. Average, young, local. They circulated the rendering internally, not to accuse, but to trigger memory. Several officers recognized a similarity to someone they had encountered previously, not in a formal criminal context, but in passing interactions. A young man who lived on the outskirts of town. A name was offered, and suddenly the investigation had a direction it hadn't possessed in weeks. Still, law enforcement moved cautiously. They had no direct evidence tying this individual to the crime. No surveillance footage, no confession, no known relationship with Shantae that would suggest motive. But proximity, combined with circumstantial alignment, made him a person of interest. A background check revealed minimal history, no convictions, no known employment, a few reports of loitering, one domestic noise complaint, but nothing violent. He had lived in the area for years, but kept mostly to himself. Neighbors described him as polite, but withdrawn. Some admitted they hadn't seen him in weeks. That detail mattered. Investigators began quiet surveillance. They wanted to understand his patterns. When he left home, who he spoke with, whether he changed routines. In cases like these, behavior tells stories long before words do. Meanwhile, another branch of the investigation focused on Shantae's digital footprint. Her phone, although deactivated shortly after she vanished, held fragments, unsent messages, draft notes, GPS logs. One particular data point stood out: a location ping in the vicinity of the farmhouse approximately 90 minutes before she was last seen. This suggested that she may have been lured or guided toward that area in advance, not abducted randomly. And if that were true, the suspect likely had access to her schedule or knew her route. Detectives revisited that vague text thread from weeks earlier, the one with an unnamed contact. The content had been ambiguous, no threats, no explicit language. But in hindsight, the tone hinted at persuasion, subtle encouragement to meet up. The number had been registered under a prepaid plan, disposable, untraceable. But it wasn't a dead end. Using cell tower triangulation, analysts cross-referenced the approximate time and location of messages sent from that number. The pattern overlapped with just a few users. One of them matched the person now under surveillance. This was the moment when the profile became more than a sketch. It began to take form. Investigators compiled every known piece of information: behavioral, geographical, technological. The suspect didn't just fit the profile. His digital and physical trail aligned with the crime itself. Still, there was no arrest. In a case this fragile, timing is everything. Arrest too early and you risk losing admissible evidence. Wait too long and you risk another crime. Law enforcement had to be deliberate, methodical. They decided to conduct what's known as a knock and talk, a non-custodial interview conducted at the suspect's home under the guise of routine questioning. The goal was not confrontation, but observation, responses, posture, eye movement, any sign of deception. The young man answered the door. He didn't deny knowing about the case, nor did he offer any connection to Shantae. His tone was measured, his answers short. When asked about his whereabouts the week she disappeared, he hesitated, but only briefly, then claimed he had been home, alone. There were no family members to confirm the alibi. As investigators left, one of them noted a set of work boots by the door. The tread was distinctive, deeply grooved, angular, similar to the partial print found near the rear entrance of the farmhouse. It wasn't enough to move forward legally, but it added pressure that would soon begin to surface elsewhere. In town, the suspect's name hadn't yet entered public discussion, but some community members had begun to whisper. People noticed the increased police presence near his home. Others had remembered brief encounters, odd conversations, strange gestures, things they had dismissed at the time. The man was still free, still walking the streets, but the face in the sketch and the one behind the door had started to merge. And in the minds of investigators, there were fewer and fewer doubts that they were getting close. The case had moved from darkness into shadow, and shadows always distort the truth before they reveal it. Pressure does not always arrive with force. In criminal investigations, especially those that rely on the unraveling of psychology rather than physical evidence, pressure is most effective when it's silent, applied subtly, indirectly, and consistently. That was the strategy investigators turned to as the suspect in Shantae Blankenship's case began to crack under the weight of quiet surveillance and social tension. The young man, unnamed publicly, uncharged officially, remained free. No handcuffs, no interrogation room. But the perimeter around him was tightening. Detectives didn't confront him with accusations. They didn't storm his residence or place him under dramatic scrutiny. Instead, they used presence. Officers began showing up around town more often. They spoke with neighbors, asked routine questions, checked up on unrelated calls, but always within the suspect's view. His name wasn't spoken, but his awareness was constantly being provoked. This was deliberate. This technique, psychological containment, serves one goal: to make the suspect feel observed, boxed in, even when no words are exchanged. Most offenders begin to fracture when they can no longer predict how close law enforcement has come. And with this man, the pattern was textbook. He stopped leaving his house at regular times. When he did go out, his movements were erratic. He no longer made eye contact at the gas station. He appeared thinner, paler. One officer observed him sitting in his truck for over an hour, staring at nothing, engine off. Then came the shift. A woman, middle-aged, approached police quietly one morning. She didn't want attention. Her connection to the case seemed minimal, just a distant neighbor of the suspect. But what she shared changed the tempo of the investigation. She had seen something weeks earlier, something she hadn't thought much of at the time. On the evening Shantae disappeared, the neighbor had gone out for a walk, a routine she rarely broke. She took the same route near the edge of the woods, across a gravel path that skirted the fields not far from the old farmhouse. She remembered seeing a vehicle parked in an odd position, not quite hidden, but not on any designated road either. It wasn't until the news broke that the farmhouse was the scene of a homicide that the memory felt relevant. The truck she described, a faded dark blue with mismatched rear lights, sounded eerily familiar to law enforcement. It matched the vehicle they had seen in the driveway of the suspect's home. What stood out even more was her memory of seeing someone step away from the tree line that night, just a silhouette, nothing distinct. But what she remembered most was the feeling that whoever it was didn't expect to be seen. When their eyes met, the figure paused, then disappeared into the woods. She hadn't recognized him, but now, she admitted, she suspected who it was. The report wasn't enough for an arrest, but it was more than enough to apply pressure. Investigators returned to the suspect's home, this time for another knock and talk. They kept the tone conversational, but asked pointed questions. Where had he been that night? Did he often visit the areas near the old farmhouse? Had he ever owned a dark-colored truck? The suspect didn't refuse to answer, but something had changed. He was fidgety, his answers shorter, vaguer. His eyes shifted more. His body language closed in on itself. When asked if he knew Shantae, he denied it again, but hesitated. One investigator noted that the denial came with a twitch of the jaw, a subtle muscle movement often seen when someone is suppressing a response. The officers left without incident, but they knew something was building. The following Sunday, the break arrived, not in the form of evidence, but in confession. It happened at a church, a modest building near the town's southern edge, attended mostly by families who had been there for generations. That morning, the congregation gathered as usual. There were hymns, scripture, a sermon on redemption. The suspect arrived late. He wasn't a regular, but his family had roots there, and no one questioned his presence. Partway through the service, during a quiet moment of reflection, he stood up. No preamble, no prompting. He walked toward the front, trembling, not with emotion, but restraint. The room fell silent. The pastor paused mid-sentence. Then the suspect spoke. "I have to tell the truth," he said. "I did something. I put her there." He didn't say her name, but he didn't have to. Some in the room gasped, others froze. A few bowed their heads, as if to shut out what they knew was coming. The pastor gently reached for his arm, guiding him away from the pulpit. There was no struggle, no drama, just quiet horror. Police were notified within minutes. The suspect didn't flee. He sat in the back pew, head down, waiting. When officers arrived, he didn't resist, but he also didn't repeat his statement. Not in the car, not at the station, and without a recorded confession or written statement, it remained unofficial. Shocking, but legally fragile. Law enforcement knew better than to rush. They secured the church's video surveillance. Multiple witnesses gave matching statements. The confession, while emotional, had occurred in public, witnessed by dozens. But to hold in court, it would need more. Intent, context, a clear link to the crime. Still, the impact was immediate. The town erupted. Whispers became certainty. And law enforcement, now armed with a direction and a community full of corroboration, began preparing for the final phase. There was no storm in the sky that day. But within the walls of that church, something far more powerful had broken open. In the days following the confession, the investigation moved into its final, most deliberate phase. No longer clouded by ambiguity or silence, detectives now worked with clarity, but not complacency. A spoken admission, no matter how public or emotionally raw, does not close a case. Not in the courtroom, not in the eyes of the law. It must be tested, dissected, and matched against evidence that speaks without motive. The young man who stood in that church and claimed responsibility for Shantae Blankenship's death now sat in an interrogation room. His expression flat, his posture withdrawn. When asked to confirm his statement formally, he nodded once, slowly. His voice was low, nearly inaudible. He described the night in fragments, details that had never been made public, the path she took, the hesitation in her voice when he first approached, the swing of the basement door. These were not things someone could guess. These were the memories of a man who had been there, and in that room beneath fluorescent light and surrounded by legal observers, he gave it to them again. "I killed her." But even then, protocol demanded more. Detectives returned to the farmhouse with renewed purpose. This time they weren't searching for a body. They were validating a confession. Using the suspect's words, they reconstructed the events minute by minute, where he stood, how he dragged her, what tools he used. Forensic technicians compared his account to every element of the scene. Blood distribution, material transfer, tool marks. The alignment was nearly perfect. A sample of soil taken from the treads of the boots by his door matched the composition of the basement floor. GPS data retrieved from his old phone, which had been recovered from a drawer in his home, placed him within a 150-meter radius of the farmhouse during the critical time frame. His vehicle, a dark blue truck with mismatched taillights, was found to have minute traces of Shantae's hair embedded in the fabric of the rear seat. And then came the final match. A complete DNA profile, extracted from under Shantae's fingernails, consistent with the suspect's. It was the last stone overturned. And under it, there were no more doubts. The arrest was swift but not dramatic. He was read his rights, placed in custody, and charged with first-degree murder. As the news spread across Lake Brownwood, the reaction was not one of shock, but of strange, bitter relief. The name had finally been spoken aloud. The question of who had been answered, but the question of why remained hollow. In recorded interviews, The suspect offered no clear motive, no specific grudge, no sudden rage. He spoke of feeling like it had to happen. He said it with the detachment of someone discussing a dream, unreal and yet already done. Mental health professionals were brought in to assess his state. Diagnoses were debated, personality disorders, signs of delusional thinking, but nothing that met the threshold for legal insanity. He had known what he was doing, he had hidden it, he had returned to the scene. He stood trial months later. The courtroom was crowded but silent. He entered with no visible emotion. The prosecution presented the facts with precision: forensic alignment, digital confirmation, behavioral indicators, and his own confession. The defense offered no alternative theory, only a plea for leniency based on impaired judgment. The jury deliberated for less than 3 hours. He was found guilty, sentenced to life without the possibility of parole. The courtroom emptied slowly. The echoes of the verdict hung heavy, not in anger, but in exhaustion. It was over. But for those who had known Shantae, the sentence offered only a boundary, not peace. Her mother spoke briefly to the press. She didn't raise her voice. She didn't curse his name. She simply said, she deserved to be seen for who she was, not for how she died. In the weeks that followed, life in Lake Brownwood resumed, but not as it had been. Some changes were small: new locks installed, curfews quietly enforced, walking trails less used. Others were deeper. Neighbors looked at one another longer. Schools implemented safety talks. A scholarship fund was created in Shantae's name, aimed at supporting young women who had experienced trauma. Yet the greatest change couldn't be measured. It lived in the air, in the space between porch lights left on too late, and conversations that avoided the subject even as it lingered. The farmhouse was eventually torn down, at the request of the county, and with the consent of the property's long-gone owners. Where it once stood, there is now a patch of flat grass, no marker, no sign. Just a silence more complete than the one that opened this story. But among the files stored in the sheriff's office, there remains one photo. Not of the crime scene, not of the suspect. It's a snapshot of Shantae, taken months before she died, sitting on the porch of her mother's home, laughing, unaware. That image, more than any document or confession, is what investigators return to when asked about the case. Because in the end, justice doesn't resurrect. It doesn't undo. It clarifies. And for a town that had mistaken quiet for safety, it finally gave them the truth. Thank you for watching our video. Please subscribe, follow us, and leave a comment. It truly helps us keep bringing you gripping and thought-provoking true crime stories.